Good morning, Canada. Greetings from the great state of South Dakota. Very glad to be here. If you're new to the conference, if you're new to what we do, and if this is your first time being at the conference, can you please raise your hand and be proud? Be proud of who you are. First time conference. Now, please hold them up for a sec. Work with me here. I need all the help I can get. As you're holding your hand up, look around to see the people that aren't holding up their hands, because they are going to be a friend for you in the future. And what I mean by that is, thank you, they have been to the conference, they have heard this information before, and they can help you be a guide to whatever journey you want to partake and accomplish on your farm. This conference is about solving problems, not giving you a reaction to a symptom of a problem, or telling you something that you can use that really isn't going to fix anything, but it'll get you through the year so they can sell you something else the next year. And I'm having technical difficulty here. Okay, still sound good? Well, not good, but hearable audio. There's an orange sheet in your folder, and this orange sheet is going to be a guide and an outline on information that you possibly may have never heard before, and it may sound absolutely crazy. This sheet you will be able to take with you to check, to see if what we have told you is true, to see if the information that we've given you is valid. This sheet will help you solve absolutely every problem in your field and in your crop. What do I mean by that? Well, we hail from the great state of South Dakota, and we get a lot of calls and emails from all over the country and all over the world. And we had a call from the Dominican Republic. And this gentleman was growing dragon fruit. Any of you guys ever have any experience with dragon fruit, growing it? Not so much. And he's telling me his problems. And I said, well, you have acute case of carbon and oxygen deficiency. And it gets quiet. And I said, you still there? He goes, yeah. He goes, well, he says, you got to understand. He says, we're losing some trees. He says, some roots, we're getting some dieback on the roots. I said, those roots have an acute case of carbon and oxygen deficiency. Long pause again. He says, well, my soil has been compacted. And he says, it's hard when we get rain, and we get rain. He says, I'm getting more runoff than I used to. I said, your soil has an acute case of carbon and oxygen deficiency. Where am I going with this? All of us are in this wonderful fraternity called farming. We can't help you with the markets. We doggone sure can't help you with the weather. But there's a lot of other stuff that we can control. What do I mean by that? If you had a harvest and your test weight was a little light, we're going to tell you why. You guys already know why, because you had a carbon and oxygen deficiency. If you had some rust, some fungus, some powdery white mildew, some bad disease, those plants had a carbon and oxygen deficiency. If your soil gets hard and crusted and compacted and lumpy and clumpy, that soil has an acute case of carbon and oxygen deficiency. Where am I going with this? The information that we're going to tell you is different from what mainstream agriculture has thrown at us for decades. And just being honest, I think the information that they gave us was purposely misleading. What do I mean by that? If we have no problems in our fields, universities don't get paid and companies don't pay to come up with a reaction to a symptom. So if your test weight was a little too light, we'll tell you how to solve that. If your yield, your bushels, your tons wasn't quite what you wanted, we're going to show you how to solve that. Point being is 90% of the problems that we have in the field, in the crop, and Dr. Dykstra, I'm going to call on you here in just a little bit. I need you, man. But 90% of the problems that we fight as growers, as farmers, as producers, goes back to a carbon and oxygen deficiency. Would you agree or disagree, Doctor?
I will agree. I just did that for dramatic poetry.
Did that hurt just a little bit? Everybody talks about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They want to sell us more. The co-ops show up, and these are all products that companies make money off of. You need them, but do we need them to the extent that they've been pushed on us? The reason I bring up this orange sheet is a few years ago in California, the company Acres USA had a healthy soil summit. And this healthy soil summit, they called and they said, we'd like you to give a talk. And do you have a grower in the Sacramento, California area that we can do a field tour? It's like, well, I'll have to check with the grower. So we had a field tour, and this particular grower, he's on some of our videos, Frank Oligari, and he was willing to share what he had done. And every grower we work with, it's a journey. And when we first started working with him, he was a long way from being organic. And I said, do you ever want to be organic? He goes, no. And he goes, should I? It's like, well, your soil isn't ready, your plants aren't ready. If you try to go organic now, it's going to hurt. It's going to leave a mark. There will be something that will not grow back. It's like the plants in the soil will tell us when you're ready for organic. And he kind of gave me a look, and he didn't really understand what I meant. But as we went through this is what we did with him over the course of time, and he was part of why this orange sheet came about. A lot of the conferences that you go to, there'll be a speaker that say, you have to balance your soil. You got to get your soil healthy. You got to be regenerative. And then they talk for 45 minutes and don't say anything that was of any value. To start off with this, I'd like to give you our definition of what we consider healthy. Simple, South Dakota straightforward. Healthy in my mind is without disease or impairment. Nothing complicated. So as we start this journey, there's a pie chart on the top left-hand side of your sheet. And it gives the components of what healthy soil is made up of. Now, if this is new to you, it's new to science. The first book I saw this written in was published in 1853. This information has been out there. If we understand what healthy is, we know how to maintain it, we know how to identify it, we know how to create it and keep it going, there's a lot of other people and companies we're not going to need. And that's not the American way. Looking at this pie chart, the largest portion, or one of the portions on the left-hand side, there's a number that says 45%. And if you would be so kind to grab a pen, and in healthy soil, 45% of that soil is made up of your soil minerals, your soil test, which we're going to get into a little bit deeper after the coffee break. Most of us have soil tested at some point in time. And I've gotten called in on so many different operations, and they will have stacks of soil tests. And they'll say, we've used this test, we've used that test, we've checked this, we've checked that, we've done a 0 to 6, we've done a 0 to 12. And I said, great, what have you learned? Long pause. Not as much as what we'd like to have learned. If you get your soil test perfect, according to academia, you score a 45% on your grade. Your grade is your crop. Your grade is the quality. Your grade is what you harvest. Your grade is, do you have enough money at the end of the year to pay off some debt, upgrade some equipment, and do it again next year? Our old scientist, when he looked at a soil test, he would say a soil test is a set of numbers that are precisely ambiguous. I go, say that again? He goes, these numbers are precisely ambiguous. I said, what does that mean? He said they're a set of numbers that really don't tell you what you need to know. And our journey continues. So they will show you calcium, phosphorus, potassium, all the different minerals. Great. Do they tell you if they're available? Do they tell you if those minerals want to take a trip to the plant? Do they tell you if they're in good form? No. They just say they're there. These numbers are good, but there's more to it than that. At the top of that pie chart, there's 5%. And according to academia, if you have 5% soil organic matter, you have healthy soil. I am here to tell you, I don't believe that. Why? Because we've done a lot of research on our farm. And some of our farm has a 4.8, 4.9 to 5.2% soil organic matter. And we've done some tests and some research that didn't work. And the weeds outgrew the crop. In our country, 28 bushel beans is the norm on dry land soybeans. In our county in South Dakota, 153 to 156 bushel is the average of corn. Where we had all of our minerals right, pH was good, calcium was good, phosphorus was good, all the minerals were in line. Looking at the soil test, it's like, we should have a ripping yield. And we didn't. 10 bushel soybeans, ouch. 60 to 100 bushel corn, double ouch. How can this be? We're going according to what academia says. When we do research on our farm, and we get paid to do quite a bit every year, we don't just do testing for 1 year. We'll try products for 2 years and watch it for a third to not only see what we've seen the first 2 years we applied it, but was there something residual that may have shown up later. What this means is we've got a lot of failed areas in our farm. And when I speak about problems, test weight, disease, insects, we're living it. And we invited it. And we created it. So as I tell you how to fix these things, this isn't something I heard or something I read. This is real. This is something we're living. So we've covered 45% of healthy soil is soil minerals. 5% is soil organic matter. Anybody have an idea what the last 50% that's equally divided into 25% increments, what that last 50% of the soil should be? Oh, and the choir sings. Air and water. That was a great answer. Well, and you just made $2 the easy way. Why would a bald guy from South Dakota give somebody $2 for a right answer? And thank you for that wonderful answer. Because make no mistake, knowledge is power and power rules the world. And the more information you have about your situation, your farm ground, your operation, the less influence you need from outside sources and the more problems you can solve and fix on your own. 25% of good healthy soil is air, and 25% of good healthy soil is water. The reason they balance is because you have to have the airspace in the soil to create pockets and storage and room for water. Does it give anywhere on your soil test how much air is in your soil? No. Is breathing important? Nobody thinks about it until you can't breathe. Without air, nothing good happens. We started playing with a soil penetrometer or a compaction meter many, many years ago. And when we first started, we had no idea what we were doing, like most things. And so we started doing cause and effect. We'd go out and we'd check soil, and then we'd watch the results. We'd look at the increments of that crop, of that soil, and we slowly figured out that there are specific numbers that have to happen. A lot of growers will buy one of these and they'll say, yeah, we got one of those compaction meters that you always are yakking about. When should we test our soil? When it's wet or when it's dry? It's like, ooh, good question. My answer was always yes. It's like, no, dum-dum. When should we check our soil? It's like, well, let me ask you this. If you go out when your soil is wet, things are nice, soft, and mellow. You can go down and probably touch your knuckles to the dirt without having a lot of resistance. They're like, yeah. But I said, when it gets dry, a lot of times it gets hard. Soil has personality. People have personality. If you spray somebody with water, it may change their personality for a short period of time. What is water made of? Hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. Here comes another tough question. When you're looking at wet soil and dry soil, if the dry soil is hard and like a brick, what are you lacking? The wet soil, soft and mellow, has hydrogen and oxygen in there. Now, if you didn't enjoy chemistry in high school or college, this is not chemistry for dummies. This is chemistry for smarties. It's the cut to the chase, get to the real answer. So when you're looking at water, if your soil can't hang on to the hydrogen and oxygen of water, it gets hard. When you look at your soil pH, pH is measuring potential hydrogen. Hydrogen is in water. Nobody talks about hydrogen at a farm meeting. I was in Nebraska last week, and there were 50 co-ops that brought me in to give a little talk. And the guys that brought me in, they said, we've seen your videos, we love what you say, but we don't want you to give our growers more than just a sliver of information. It's like, we still have to sell fertilizer, we still have to sell chemicals. It's like, well, appreciate you for being honest. When a person knows the whole truth, it's hard to tell just a fraction of it. And as I'm talking about hydrogen and carbon and oxygen and looking at the people's eyes, oh my gosh, it was a rainbow of emotions. Some guys were like, what are you talking about? Some guys crossed their arms and said, oh, this guy's stupid. And they're all right. Each and every mineral and element has a job and a personality, just like letters in the alphabet. The ABCs of the alphabet, has that ever changed in our lifetime? Everybody talks about ABCs. 1, 2, 3. Once you understand the jig, you understand the system, it doesn't matter what you grow. You can create the environment to grow food. You can engineer your soil to grow healthy, nutritious food. What do I mean by that? Years ago, and when I say years ago, close to 40 years ago, our old professor would say, I just want good food. And I heard him, but I really didn't register. And as I get older, and if I'm traveling or shopping, I buy some blueberries or some strawberries or some vegetables, and I see within a few days they rot, they mold, they deteriorate. And I start thinking, it's just like, if this plant or this fruit or berry or vegetable doesn't have enough nutrition to stay good for a little while, what's it going to do to us? Are we going to deteriorate, rot, and mold prematurely? Possibly. The food system is damaged, and I think it was a plan. Sorry to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but there's no money for the other companies when we know how to solve the problem. So as we look at the problem, and you check your soil when it's wet, and you check your soil when it's dry, 150 psi, which is the line just below this graph, 150 psi is the surface tension or the lack of compaction your soil should be at. I'll go a little more definitive in that. On all good penetrometers, there's a big tip. This is for sand. There's a smaller tip. This tip is for dirt and clay. Use the appropriate tip. If you've got some beach sand like we deal with in Florida, you're going to want the big tip. And if you push it down, Dr. Dykstra understands beach sand in Florida. We don't have enough resistance in that soil. That soil, in South Dakota terms, is diuretic. If you're a livestock guy, it's scouring. Things are blowing through. You have to create some tension to hold the nutrients that you buy so the roots can get at them. So if you have really loose, mellow, Non-compacted soil, you have to create some resistance to hold the nutrients in that profile to get your money's worth. If you have dirty, rotten, hard, tight soil, you have to relax that soil to get air in there. What do I mean by this? While I'm up here, I'm going to jump in and out of quite a few different sciences. Agronomy tells us that chemistry solves all problems. They're all-knowing, and they can tell us everything we need to grow a crop. We're going to jump into meteorology for just a little bit. Meteorology is important because weather. Weather sometimes plays a factor in farming. When we watch the weatherman, we see that there's high pressure fronts and there's low pressure fronts. This is important. A high pressure front, and if you're a pilot, you learned this, is heavy sinking air. Why is this important? Because during a high pressure front, this air is designed to move into your soil. And when this air moves into the soil, there's your nitrogen. 78% of every breath we take of atmospheric air is nitrogen. Why do we buy so much nitrogen? Possibly because our ground may be just a little bit tight. During this high pressure front, if you're over 200 psi on this meter, this air will bounce. And you will not get the 78% nitrogen. You will not get the 20% oxygen. And you'll not get the 400 and some parts per million of CO2. That's all free. You just have to invite it. If you're over 200 psi in your soil, please don't buy a bunch of microbes or mycorrhizal fungi and expect them to save the day. Because PSI, pressure, tension, surface pressure, over 200 PSI, the microbes will do this. Oh no, we are not working in this environment. It's too stressful, too much pressure, we can't handle it. I think the soil microbes are union. It's like, we're going to wait until better conditions are presented. If your soil gets even tighter and you're up to 300 psi, a feeder root, fine thread feeder root, can't push through 300 psi. It's like, oh, well, we'll just relax that soil a little bit, just get it under 300, and that feeder root can push through. Well, here's more of the story. If you're over 200 psi, that little feeder root is unprotected. And what I mean by that is that root wants to be covered in beneficial aerobic soil microbes. And if you're over 200 psi, these microbes aren't going to work. So as you're looking at your soil, if you don't have one of these, you don't have to buy one. When you get home, tell your neighbor, it's like, hey, I got a piece of equipment you're going to love. Have him buy it, you can tell him how to use it, and you'll both benefit. This is probably the one tool that will save you more money, that will make you more money, and you can have it for yourself, and you buy it once and you never have to worry about it again. But please check your soil. So a lot of times we have guys, we had 2 organic growers in the US, and they called and said, we had pretty good yields, but we got some thistle problems. And it says, one guy says, I got reported. The other guy says, I didn't get reported, but I don't like it. He says, your recommendations aren't worth a squat. He says, these weeds are big, dirty, rotten, nasty, horrible, and they're out of control. And I say, well, if you choose to do this, take a soil test inside that patch of weeds, and then take a soil test just outside that patch of weeds and compare it. And what you will find on a soil test, which gives you 45% of what the soil is, there isn't much difference. Nothing stands out and says, aha, this is the problem. So it's like, well, there was some wasted time and money. Depending on the weeds that are growing, you probably have some compaction. Now, when I say compaction, every weed is growing where it's growing for a reason. If you have a big, nasty, sharp, prickly weed like a Canada thistle, and thank you for giving us Canada thistle, we in the States all appreciate that. Or if it gets worse, you get some bull thistles or some musk thistles. There's two things that aren't in the soil that tells you why that weed is growing. Now, academia, when asked about weeds, they will proudly stand up, bow out their chest, and say, a weed is just a plant growing out of place. I get it, but yet I don't. Because a weed has a completely different appetite. It has a whole different agenda than a food crop. If you have a big, heavy, tap-rooted weed, and please dig it up, you'll see that these big, heavy, tap-rooted weeds have the ability to push through more than 600, 700, 800 psi of surface tension. That weed is just not growing out of place. That weed is telling you, hey, we got a problem here. My roots can't breathe. We need to open up this soil. And so many times here comes a spray bar with a herbicide and you just killed the scout. So the weed is a problem, but it isn't the problem. There's two things that your soil is deficient in that's allowing those weeds to grow. The two things we talked about in the beginning, carbon and oxygen. Two things that your soil test doesn't show you. Now, if it sounds like I'm hacking on the soil testing companies, I'm not. They do as good a job as they can. We need their information, but please keep in mind, it doesn't tell us the whole story. So, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into soil tests after coffee break. But looking at soil, if you have 25% air in the soil, 25% water, 45% minerals, and if you have 5% soil organic matter, technically healthy. But if it can't breathe, make sure you test the compaction. In the spring, just coming out of winter, coming out of frost, coming out of the tundra that we all live through, will be the softest, mellowest, most forgiving soil of the year. As it goes on, the more marginal soil, and when I say marginal soil, the soil that has the least amount of carbon, the least amount of oxygen, will start changing its personality in something none of us appreciate. It's Mother Earth telling us a story. Our old professor would say, look at what you see and listen to what you hear. And I'm a little slow, but I'm consistent. And I'd say, look at what you see, listen to what you hear. He goes, pay attention, dummy. Everything tells you a story. Mother Nature, Mother Earth, she's female. And if Mama ain't happy, Anybody know the rest of that statement? Nobody's happy. Yeah. She tells us when she's not happy. So what do? Get a stronger chemical. Apply more fertilizer. Ignore the signs that she's telling us. Go with the information that's given that isn't complete and hope for the best and spread more kilicides, spread more products that react to symptoms, and never fix what's really going on. Next pie chart is a healthy plant. Most plants that are growing in the field are about 75 to 85% water. Water's a variable, so let's take that and get rid of it, which means we have 20% solids, dry matter left. Without the water, we've just got the dry matter. You guys already know what 47% of that dry matter weight of the plant should be, and you already know what 43% of the dry matter weight of that plant should be, because 47% of the plant should be carbon. 43% of the plant should be oxygen. How many of us pay or monitor carbon and oxygen in our crops and fields? Who does that? Well, the grape growers monitor sugar, carbon, oxygen, because you can't make a good wine if you don't have enough sugar. 47% of the plant is carbon, 43% of the plant is oxygen. This is a healthy plant. And what I mean by healthy, does not need a fungicide, does not need a herbicide. It is strong enough to outgrow, shake off disease. It's strong enough and healthy enough to outgrow any weed pressure that you have, and it's strong enough and healthy enough to not get eaten by an insect above or below the ground. What I mean below the ground, if you have armyworms, wire worms, root worms, cutworms, you have deficiency in two things. You know the answer, carbon and oxygen. Why? Well, I don't want to step on Dr. Dykstra's toes because he's the doctor of entomology. He understands why insects are doing what they're doing. I'll give you the cut to the chase. We found out long ago, and Dr. Dykstra confirmed it, plant-feeding insects above or below the ground are born and live without a pancreas. They can't digest sugar. The sugar will ferment, turn to alcohol, and kill them. Wow. Mother Nature's pretty cool. Natural insecticide, which comes from sugar. And if you didn't appreciate chemistry, similar to I didn't appreciate chemistry, and I wish I would have, if you look at what sugar is what the plant is trying to make. The plant lays its leaves out to gather sunlight, water, minerals to make sugar. They call this photosynthesis. They taught us this in 8th grade. This photosynthesis that makes sugar, and if we had a chemist up here and we said, tell us what sugar is, chemists would say, well, sugar is a combination of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And I'd say, well, Mr. Chemistry, please be more specific. Well, he says a simple sugar that many plants make is 6 parts carbon, C6, 12 parts hydrogen, H12, 6 parts oxygen, O6, C6H12O6, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. What are the 3 main components of the dry matter weight of a plant? Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. There's a plan here. This all seems to work. And if the plant can make sugar, photosynthesis, you now have resistance against fungus, powdery white mildew, smut, weeds, and insects. The sugar is the plant's fuel. The sugar is the defense for that plant. The sugar is what gives you test weight. The sugar is what gives you yield. The sugar is what makes you money. And when you make more sugar, you spend less money reacting to symptoms because you have now created or engineered an environment that grows healthy plants. Okay, so we got 47% carbon, we got 43% oxygen, we got 4% hydrogen. There's 6% left. Anybody got an idea what the last 6% is? Crickets. Yes. Oh, golly. There's a buck. 3%. Now, please think about this, if you will. 3%. Thank you for that.
It's like $4.
That's a dollar answer. Come on, you got to pick up the pace. Oh, $4. Well, by golly, you're welcome. That was a $4 answer. Soil mineral. Think about this. Soil mineral only makes up 3% of the dry matter weight of a plant. Let's back up. Soil minerals make up 45% of the soil. If you get your soil test perfect, you get a 45% grade on the soil test. Transfer that to the plant, 3%? Do we wonder why agriculture may be in the crapper? We're dealing with the minority inclusion of nutrients that's like a hangnail when we're bleeding out of a jugular vein. The last 3% of a healthy plant is made up of almost everybody's biggest input, nitrogen. Nitrogen is the largest increment or inclusion in atmospheric air, but that air has to get into the ground. Here's something they probably haven't told you, and you will have figured this out by looking at the numbers. A plant wants carbon. A plant wants oxygen. A plant wants hydrogen. If it can't find it, it'll say, oh, give me some nitrogen. It's only supposed to be 3%, but the more you give me, the more unhealthy I'm going to be. And the more unhealthy I'm going to be, the less I'm going to yield. The lower the test weight, the more disease, the more the problem. But just keep giving it to me, and I'll keep giving you back what you deserve. Problems, low yields, low test weight, disease, heartbreak, and confusion. Like, God, we're doing everything that the big companies tell us. Why are we having so many problems? Underneath that chart, there's 2 minerals that you have to focus on in the tissue, the petiole, or the wet chemistry of a plant. These 2 minerals are the first 2, not the only 2, but the first 2 minerals that are needed. And from what we have found over the last 40 years, the 2 most important minerals to give the plant the ability to photosynthesize or to start making sugar, the essence of the plant. 94% of what it's made of is carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. If you do a tissue, if you do a petiole, if you do a sap test, you need at least 2% calcium in that plant to start the process. You need 0.3 or 0.3 of phosphorus. In my simple South Dakota mind, I look at calcium. It's kind of the mother of the minerals. She's the nester. She's the creator of the environment. She allows everything to happen. She's a fixer of all boo-boos. She relaxes the environment and creates a wonderful home where everything can live. And every good mom needs a dad, and in my mind, that's phosphorus. You can have all the numbers you want in the soil. If they're not getting to the plant, pucker up because hell's coming. And we've all had that agronomist, we've all had that fertilizer salesman saying, well, you don't have too bad of a level of phosphorus, you don't, or you don't have too bad a level of calcium, but, and here come the terms, not available, tied up. What's that mean? So you just might as well buy some more. It's there, but you can't get at it. Well, that's stupid. I've already got it. Why do I need to buy more? We'll get into that in the next session. How can we possibly tell if we have enough carbon and oxygen in a plant? If you've never seen one of these pieces of equipment before, they're a fairly new invention called a refractometer that measures the sugar content of the sap or the juice of the plant. They haven't been around long. Dr. Brix invented it in 1859. The wine industry has used this for years, and if you enjoy a good glass of wine, this is why. If you talk to most co-ops, most synthetic companies, most kilocide companies, they'll say, refractometer. It really isn't that accurate. If it's cloudy, you're going to get one number. If it's in the early morning, you're going to get a different number. If it's a sunny day and late in the afternoon, you're going to get a different number. He says, they'll say, yeah, you can sure try it, but we really haven't seen many results. Well, and what they're saying is true. But if you don't know the whole story, you hear that and go, wow, why would I spend $100 on this if it's just a joke? There's a blue prism of glass that you put a drop on, and you got to have some really high-tech equipment to make this happen. And if this just looks like a simple garlic press, you're right. Put some tissue into the garlic press, squeeze 2 or 3 drops on there. Make note of what time of the day and what type of day it is. If it's early morning and it's cloudy, your sugar content will be lower because the plant needs sunshine to make photosynthesis. Squeeze the juice, point it at the light, focus it, and there will be a separation between blue and white. And that's the sugar content of the plant. Big deal. What's this mean? If you have less than 8 bricks, B-R-I-X, of sugar, pucker up. You're probably going to be susceptible to a fungus, an algae, a mold, anything detrimental, pathogenic, or disease-causing lives in a low sugar environment, low carbon, low oxygen, low hydrogen. This is why I started off a healthy plant, carbon and oxygen. If you're under 10 bricks of sugar, you're probably going to have some weeds. How do we know this? Because weeds do not like carbon and oxygen. There's a book. You can buy it, but you don't have to. There's a book called When Weeds Talk. Jay McCaman was the author, and he did a wonderful job, and he listed all of these weeds alphabetically, and he tells what environment these weeds like to grow in. And when I started buying this book, when I bought the book, it was after 16 months worth of testing where we had some scientists we were paying to figure out why weeds were growing. And here's what we found. Weeds enjoy low calcium. Weeds enjoy low phosphorus. Weeds enjoy low sugar. Here comes the problem solving. How do you get rid of weeds? Make sure the ground can breathe. squeeze the sugar content or squeeze the sap right out of that weed, what you're going to find is going to be less than 10. If you find a weed that's over 10, you're going to have looked for it, because it's not very happy, it's not very healthy, and a weed is not growing in a spot out of place. It's growing exactly where it's supposed to, say, hey, we've got low carbon, we've got low oxygen, we have a problem. Change the environment, engineer the environment, get air in there, get carbon and oxygen in there, and the weed will politely bow down, show respect, and go away. We've done this for over almost 40 years. 10 bricks is a marker, and Dr. Dykstra does a much better job at this than I do, but 10 bricks is a marker for fungus, algae, mold, and weeds. If you have plant-feeding insects, you get to 13, 14 bricks of sugar, they may take a bite, but they're going to go somewhere else. That sugar will ferment, turn to alcohol, and kill them. We had a research greenhouse in our facility for many, many years, and we checked a lot of things, and we learned all this the hard way. This is measuring the fuel, the carbon, the oxygen, the hydrogen, the fuel in your plant. Questions, comments, concerns on the refractometer or the penetrometer?
What time of day are those readings at? What time of day and conditions are those readings at?
Say that again?
Well, what time of day and conditions do you want to be at that 13 to 14? Is that in the morning or the afternoon or the blend of?
Yes. And I don't mean to be a smart jack. Good, thank you, good question. What time of the day or what type of day do you want to be at 13, 14 bricks? And I apologize, thank you for bringing that up, because now I have to define this. During the day, we may have to save part of this, an awful lot of great information, but during the day, that plant's making sugar. As the sun comes up, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, maybe 3 o'clock is your highest sugar content. Late morning, early afternoon, mid-afternoon. When the sun starts setting, things start changing. And during vegetative growth, where the plant is growing root, stem, and leaf before reproduction, when the sun sets, a lot of that sugar goes out the roots. The experts call this a root exudate. It's sugar water with minerals in it. The more you check, the more you will know. And what I mean by that is, let's say you've got 13 or 14 bricks at the peak of the day. But if that drops more than 2 or 3 points, grab a shovel, because you may have some problems in the roots. The plant understands what goes on and knows it has to have more sugar around the roots than what the top part needs. And what I mean by that is, if you squeeze the top of the plant, you're going to get a number. If you squeeze the roots, you will almost always be 1 to 1.5 points or bricks higher in the roots. So it shouldn't change from the peak of the day to the low at night. It shouldn't change more than 2 points or 2 bricks. That answer your question? Thank you for that. If it's changing more than 2 bricks, keep in mind where that 2 bricks is at. If you're at 8 in the peak of the day, you're probably going to be 6 by sunup. Guess where most fungus likes to grow? In the dark, at night, with dew, in a low sugar content. So check during the day, but please keep in mind it's going to drop. And if you're just on the threshold of a problem, 8 bricks, 10 bricks, 14 bricks, really pay attention to what's going on because you could be just on the threshold of a problem. Any other comments, questions, concerns so far? Yes, sir.
There is a difference between a sharp line and a milk, like a not a sharp line on the refractometer. Could you
Say that again.
you know, when you look through the refractometer, sometimes you have a sharp line between. Can you elaborate on that?
You guys are awesome. Yes. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. If you put a Coca-Cola or a sugar pop on here, close the lid, you're going to see a razor sharp, very definitive line. It's like, bam. It's like, well, that's 9, no doubt about it. There's no or virtually no mineral. It's just sugar. And I appreciate the insight. He already knows the answer. But I think you did it for everybody else's benefit. But if you put a good, healthy crop, whether it be the plant sap, whether it be the fruit sap, whether it be the vegetable sap, the juice, and you're looking at it and it's kind of fading from blue to white, and it's like, oh, I can't tell, is it 13, is it 14? Oh, maybe it's 15. Oh, it's tough to tell. The more mineral deposition you have in the plant, the tougher it is to see where you actually are at. And normally at that point, you're in the double digits. It's like 13, 14, 15. I'm in the safe zone. I've created an environment that won't grow fungus, that won't grow algae, that won't grow mold and mildew, that won't allow weeds to outgrow us and won't grow insect food. Growing something that has longevity, immunity, and nutrition. Yes, sir.
Vegetative stage, does it influence also the sugar content? Like if you're at bud stage versus flower versus grain.
Thank you. That's a great question. The sugar content that he asked, and let me see if I get this right. Does it matter what stage of the growth of that plant it is? Here's what we do know. During vegetative growth, root, stem, and leaf, before reproduction, the sugar content that is being created, a lot of it gets pushed down out the root tips. When that plant goes into silking, tasseling, flowering, blossoming, that sugar content stops or is greatly reduced going to the roots. What happens in many cases, and when the weed appears, will tell you more once you know the story. If the plant isn't putting out a root exudate and you really don't have much weed pressure until reproduction, and all of a sudden, bam, here it comes. Your soil has a carbon and oxygen deficiency because the plant isn't feeding it, and weeds enjoy a low carbon, low oxygen environment, so here they come. When a plant goes into reproduction, flowering, silking, tasseling, blossoming, the sugar stays up in the plant to make seed, to make produce, to make food. It stops giving back. So if you see weeds showing up at boot stage, at silking, tasseling, whatever the reproduction is, you have a carbon and oxygen deficiency in your soil if the weeds are starting to show up at that time. Solving problems. How am I doing on time here? 15? Okay. Dr. Dykstra is not here to make friends today.
Oh, he's trying to be a friend right now. That's what the 40 minutes is going to be.
Moving on. If we compare this to something we're familiar with, this is like the stethoscope around the nurse's or the doctor's neck. It's checking respiration. 150 psi is where your soil needs to be to have good respiration for the microbes, for the availability of minerals, which we're going to talk about after the break, and for good, healthy, nutritious life to form. This is a fuel gauge. It's not very accurate. Gives you a ballpark. How many things in farming are accurate? How many times have you got up in the morning and said, okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this? And you blow a hydraulic hose or a flat tire or alternator goes out or a belt breaks or a bearing burns up. Your whole day gets changed. Yep, welcome to farming. This is like an old fuel gauge. Quarter of a tank, half of a tank. It gets you close. But horseshoes and hand grenades are a game that you can play and you get points for being close. It's not going to be accurate, and Dr. Dykstra will elaborate more on the accuracy, but I like to keep things simple, cheap, and inexpensive. So this is the fuel tank. Or another idea, this is like a blood panel. This will check to see what the blood or the sap of the plant has in it, and it'll tell you why these problems may be happening to your crop. So, blood panel, fuel tank, stethoscope, respiration. What's left? Heartbeat. Our hearts beat 80,000 to 120,000 times a day. What keeps them going? Don't think about it. A heartbeat, romance, and air have often been looked at similarly. None of them are important unless you're not getting them. The heartbeat is electrical. We know it's electrical because if it stops, they'll juice up the jumper cables and jumpstart you. And then they'll put you on an EKG or an ECG, measuring the electrical impulses of your heart. The soil should have a heartbeat. This is an EC meter, an electrical conductivity meter. And Dr. Dykstra taught us an enormous amount of information that refers to this. Just to cut to the chase, we need to have a certain amount of electricity in the soil. Most plants that want to germinate, or most plants that have been planted and are just emerging after winter, need the electricity of a decimal point. A 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. That's the electricity that the microbes appreciate. It's also the electricity that the microbes create. What do I mean by that? There's electricity in our bodies, there's electricity in the microbes. And Dr. Dykstra did some deep science, and he found that almost every aerobic soil microbe carries about 1/2 of a volt of electricity in your soil. One of the reasons I believe that the fertilizer companies put salt in fertilizer, and Dr. Dykstra will elaborate more on this, but one of them is because if you don't have microbes in the soil, you don't have any electricity. They put salt in there, I believe, to spark the system. And if you sprinkle a little salt on an open wound or possibly an open root, it burns. The experts in academia will say, wow, 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 wow. I said, you got to understand, every plant and the soil needs a little bit of salt. What they don't tell you is the rest of the story. There's organic salts and there's inorganic salts. Sodium chloride that you sprinkle on your steak or on your French fries or baked potato. Sodium chloride is an inorganic salt, and if you apply too much, you will kill your soil. You will kill your plant. It elevates the electricity and short circuits things out, and things stop growing. An organic salt can be about 1,000 different combinations that the microbes of the soil can take some metal-based minerals, some non-metal-based minerals, digest them, and when they decompose into a protoplasmic gel they call humus or glomalin. This carries about 1/2 volt, and it is a casserole of all the wonderful things that that microbe wanted to eat. The appetite and what a microbe wants to eat is exactly the same appetite and what a plant needs to grow. If the microbes in your soil are happy, your plants will be well fed and they will be happy. So the reader point is the 2 metal tips. And so many guys will just go in and they'll just stab it in and take one look. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. The roots are supposed to be everywhere. Let's say my fingers are the soil. Slowly push it in. Watch your numbers. The more consistent your numbers are, the more steady that reading is, the more biologically harmonized or balanced your soil is. They will create the environment that the plant wants. During growth, the plant wants to start off at a 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, somewhere in there. Some guys will say, do we check when the soil's wet or do we check when it's dry? My answer is yes. If your numbers drop dramatically when your soil is wet, that probably isn't biologically influenced. The more volatility these numbers have between wet and dry will be determined by the biological activity in the soil. If the microbes are happy and healthy and they've got carbon and oxygen and all the other nutrients they need, they're going to hold this number pretty steady whether the soil's wet or dry. It will vary some, but the healthier it is, the less variance you get. 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 is what the plant wants for root, stem, and leaf. Once you go into reproduction, the plant needs more energy. What was a 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 now needs to be a 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, or 0.9. If you go to a field and you see nothing growing and you stab it in there and it's a 1.2, you probably have some excess salt or sodium that has accumulated in that area and created too much electricity, and most aerobic microbes do not appreciate much over a 1.0. They're the parameters. These microbes are union, and they say there's too much electricity. We are not going to go to work and get shocked. We will spore off. We will stay dormant. We will wait for better working conditions before we return to work. This is the heartbeat. Between the heartbeat, the blood, and the respiration, you can do your own health check, and you can start creating numbers that add to your soil test that give you a bigger picture, a more accurate picture, and a more profitable picture. In the middle of this sheet, there's some carbon to nitrogen numbers. If you ask academia, they will talk about nitrogen, they'll talk about phosphorus, they'll talk about potassium. If you ask them about carbon, they'll bow up on you and say, carbon? You probably have 8 times more carbon than nitrogen in your soil, making it sound like, oh, we're in there. Well, if you ask a microbiologist the same question, he will be a lot more timid. And he'll say, well, if you talk to the agronomy department, they'll say an 8-to-1 is fantastic. He says the beneficial aerobic workers, the microbes in the soil, need a 16-to-1 carbon to nitrogen. That's the second line that you may want to fill in. 8-to-1 is what most soil is. 16-to-1 is the very minimum that you have microbes ripping, tearing, honeymooning, partying, and making stuff available. If you have been one of the growers that have bought some mycorrhizal fungi and have put it out and possibly not seen results financially, mycorrhizal fungi need an 18, 19, 20-to-1. You got to get a lot of microbes going. And a lot of times the academia will say, do not till your soil. You will rip and tear and destroy all the proper mycorrhizal fungi in your soil. Well, if you've got an 8 or a 10 or a 12-to-1 or a 14-to-1, you don't have many mycorrhizal fungi in your soil. Create the environment. Reduce the pressure or increase the pressure so the nutrients stay where it's at with the penetrometer. See how much sugar the plant is making. Take a look at the electricity or the heartbeat. And what you'll find is when you get your carbon to nitrogen up to 18, 19-to-1, boom, there's mycorrhizal fungi in my soil. Where did they come from? These fungi that are beneficial are also union. They're saying, we need carbon. We need carbon, we want a lot of it, and we need oxygen. And we are not coming to work until we get our demands met. The last number in the middle of that category is good compost. 30-to-1 is good compost. 30 times more carbon than nitrogen. Now, go up and look what a healthy plant is made of. When you look at carbon, you always have to figure in oxygen. You have to look at them both. When you add carbon and oxygen together, 47 and 43, is that 90? And then compare that to the level of nitrogen in the soil. 3. Is that a 30-to-1? Sure, that's just coincidence. This is the math. This is the science that they have kept from us. The last four or five lines on the bottom of that sheet is what we have found to be the quickest, cheapest, easiest way for you to take a look at your soil and start healing it, start rebuilding it, start it on a process of growing what you want that makes you money versus growing something that costs you money to get rid of. Number one, in the soil, you have to have mom. Mom's got to be there, and that's calcium. She's got to be there, and she's got to be available. What do I mean by that? Any good mother has to breathe. And if you have been a no-till farmer, calcium is kind of a big old gal. She's fairly heavy. And if you don't till your soil, she will slowly move down through the profile. And you may do a 0 to 6 inch, sorry, this is English, US, a 0 to 6 inch soil test, and it may show all kinds of calcium. But you probably don't have much calcium in the top inch, or the second inch, or the third inch. 80 to 90% of your calcium is going to be in the 4th, 5th, or 6th inch. Sometimes a little tillage, bring mom back up on top. Every good mother has to have dad, a father. Number 2 is phosphorus. Phosphorus doesn't leach up or down, but it moves sideways, and it'll travel with water. Phosphorus loves to breathe. And if your soil test shows you have total P for phosphorus, or P1, or P2, big deal. The plant only wants P2O5. What's that mean? For every 2 phosphorus, you got to have a handful of oxygen. So when the salesman for fertilizer says, you got some phosphorus, but it's unavailable. Or you got some phosphorus, but it's tied up. It just doesn't have any oxygen. Get some air, get some oxygen in the soil, and that phosphorus is now going to be available. So calcium and phosphorus are needed for biological, physical structure. They're needed to start the photosynthetic process of the plant. In order for a plant to make sugar, it's got to have some raw ingredients. Number 3 is carbon. If you don't have the carbon in the soil, the plant won't make any sugar for you. If you don't have the carbon in the soil, the microbes can't exhale carbon dioxide. A plant is made up primarily of carbon and oxygen, 90%. If a microbe is breathing like we do, it's breathing in air and it's exhaling carbon dioxide, CO2. Could that be the pump, the supplier of 2 of the raw ingredients that the plant needs to make sugar? And that answer is yes! Make the microbes happy and the microbes make the plant healthy. So number 1, you got to get calcium in the soil. Number 2, you got to make sure phosphorus is there because Dad makes things happen. Number 3 is carbon. Number 4 is oxygen. And number 5, once you have those in place, you now have earned the right to start putting out some more beneficial microbes. That if you have an environment for them, and if you feed them, they will work for you. We've done extensive work on microbes, and we actually made a microbial extractor, and we quit making it because too many people weren't understanding what has to happen. We sent these extractors to different parts of the country. We sent 4 of them out to California. We gave them the extractor. We gave them the extract that was all fantastic. And I said, use this however you see fit and tell me if it makes or saves you money. 2 years later, we got all those extractors back. They said, we didn't see anything. More work, more expense if we had to buy this, but nothing better. No more quantity, no higher quality. And so we started looking. And that's when we reconfirmed that if the soil doesn't breathe, don't put out more microbes to suffocate. If the electricity isn't there, if the carbon to nitrogen ratio isn't there, the beneficial microbes that you buy aren't going to work for you. And a lot of the microbial assays and the colony forming unit counts that we did with the biological end, we would check the soil, and what we would see is when we put out an extract or a compost tea, we would see anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 weeks of biological activity before they shut down. What shut them down? Simple things. They're uppity, like we can't breathe. Why are we going to work if we can't breathe? They want to eat. The 2 simplest things, food and water, shut down the microbes. These are the numbers that have taken us almost 40 years to put together. These are the numbers that will reduce your synthetic fertilizer need. These are the numbers that will reduce your nitrogen bill. These are the numbers that will reduce your kilocide bill. fungicides, herbicides, insecticides. Engineering and creating proper, positive environment will grow good things. Are you going to have the Garden of Eden next year? No. Things happen. Even if you teach your kid, now help me out here, my parents never taught us how to spit, lie, cheat, or steal. Probably just like your parents, but we all learn. How did we know how to do all these things? Even in a good environment, bad things can happen. But the more parameters that you look at and compare and monitor and engineer, the better the environment and the better the outcome will be. Comments, questions, concerns so far? Cindy in the back.
I've had a couple questions from various people saying that the C to N ratio should not go over 20.
Say that
One.
again.
I said I've had several comments about industry saying that the C to N ratio shouldn't go over 20:1 because the microbes will then take out the organic matter too quickly. Can you comment on that?
How much time do I have left? 20? You guys are in trouble. We still got more time. Your chemical, fertilizer, or synthetic salesman will warn you. Be careful with putting out carbon. Don't put out too much carbon. And this is where they say, and here's why you don't want to put out any carbon. Because that carbon that you add will tie up your nitrogen. Tie it up. And he's right. But it's supposed to. What's the plant want to be made of? Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, i.e. sugar. They will say if you put carbon out there, it's going to make your microbes lazy. They're not going to do anything for you. Well, being from South Dakota, I have friends that have had young children. And my friends hated me at a fairly deep religious level because every time they'd come over, just when they're getting ready to leave, I'd hand them all a can of Mountain Dew and a Snicker bar. Give them a little sugar for the ride home. And my friends would politely look at me and say, "We hate you." I don't have any children, so they don't have the ability to repay me. Sugar is the essence of life. Sugar is what the plant is made of. Sugar is part of what the plant needs for longevity, for shelf life. They will tell you, boy, be careful. You put that carbon, that sugar out there, and you're really going to cause problems. I was in Washington State a few years ago and doing a meeting, and it was a big group of people. And this great big fellow and his two sons, who were also big fellows, walk up and he said, "Yeah, my name's Joe, and these are my two boys. We farm about 35,000 acres, and we believe nothing of what you've just said. It's completely against what everybody has told us. We think you're nuts, but we're chemical farmers." They said, "Give us one thing that will possibly change our mind from you being batshit crazy." And I said, "Okay." I said, "I can't make this recommendation, but I'll put it to you in the form of a question. Have you ever put," and I asked Joe this, I said, "have you ever put a pound of white household table sugar in with your chemical?" And he backs up and looks down. He goes, "I deserve this, I asked." He goes, "No, we have never put a pound of sugar with our chemical. Why would we do that?" I said, "Because if you have a fungus, a detrimental, pathogenic, disease-causing fungus in your crop that you need a fungicide, it's because you have a carbon and oxygen deficiency. Sugar, carbon and oxygen. If you choose to put a pound of sugar, and this is a tip for everybody, if you still have chemicals, a pound of sugar will give that plant a little bit of fuel. You will see less stress from the chemical on the plant. You will see the chemical work better. And I told Joe, and I said, and if you choose to do this, after you try it, please give me a call and I'll tell you what your next question is going to be. Well, a month and a half later, I get this call from Washington State. Yeah, this is Joe. I talked to you out in Cheney, Washington. I said, well, hi, Joe. He goes, what's my question? It's like, I did this to myself. And I'm trying to think back. It's like, okay. I said, your question, if you put out the chemical with some sugar, you saw a better kill with less plant stress. Your next question is, how far can you cut back your chemical? Long pause. And I hear this crap. And I said, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole because that's where lawsuits come from. But what I can tell you, I said, I'm not a chemical rep and I don't want to be. But what I can tell you is when growers have put a pound of sugar in with their chemical, they see better results from the chemical. And most growers, this isn't a recommendation, this is just what we've seen, most growers can cut back very safely 10% of their next application of chemical. Now, tongue in cheek on this one, please know where you're at. If you've got a horrible compacted field and the bricks of your plant is 2, you're not going to see fantastic results with a pound of sugar. That's like peeing on a prairie fire. But knowing where you're at, you will know what the next move is going to be and the results you will have. Comments, questions, concerns? Ah, come on. You're being too easy on me. Yes, sir. $2.
They want me to use the mic.
You in stereo.
Okay. This is a very specific question, but it has to do with using your products. You've talked about Frank Oligari in California and how when you started with him, he couldn't put the tip of the penetrometer in the ground. Is that correct?
Yes.
In his orchard.
Yes.
And 5 years later, he could bury it to his knuckles.
Yes.
Now, I've been using your products for 5 years, and I have some apple trees, and I've been putting it on the fields, and I have not seen that kind of improvement. What did you do on his orchard? How many grams did you put on?
I am so glad you're here. Did everybody hear that? I just got politely hammered. And thank you for being honest. If you have deficiencies in your soil, going back to the very beginning, we can open up your soil. We can get air in. We can get it to breathe. But if you don't have carbon, the microbes continue to maintain the environment that our calcium provides. Our calcium is electrical. Everything in the world is electrical. And that's a very good question, and I'm glad you brought that up. If the microbes can breathe and have food and air, and they can party, they will continue the environment that the calcium has created. Now, there's more to it than that, like there always is. If you're using a high salt fertilizer, or if you're spreading some manure, and we'll get into this, or if you're using some things that are dampening the effects or killing the microbes, we will not create and engineer and perfect that environment as quick as what anybody would like to. In other words, are you slamming your fingers in the door and you're worried about letting go of the addiction to your nitrogen that has high salt, to the chemicals that have high salt, and all of these kill microbes? Dr. Dykstra will go into that more specifically. But at some point in time, I'd like to be able to talk to see, A, is there something else that we're not seeing? And many times it may take 2 to 3 to 4 years. One thing in California, our best results are in California because it doesn't freeze and we have biological activity all year long. Dr. Frank Oligary had also done, if you're familiar with Neil Kenzie follows the Albrecht program with the base saturation. He spent 6 years putting all of his minerals together, that he had a 68% base saturation of calcium. He had an 18% base saturation of magnesium. And yes, when we did start, we couldn't get the tip in. He had all the elements correct on his soil test, but he didn't have the air, he didn't have the electricity. We're more of the physics that's added to the chemistry. So as you look at what's going on, you can quickly speed up the healing process. But the orange sheet has many different purposes. It's a guide that you can take with you. It's the secrets of the industry that they didn't want you to know. It's the holy grail of growing. But again, if your available calcium isn't there, you may need to add some calcium carbonate. And we'll talk about that in the next session right after coffee break. But making sure to see, do you have an inventory of raw ingredients? Do you have a workforce, i.e. microbes, that are happy to be there and work for you? Is the electricity of your soil where it needs to be? And if it's not, the microbes may not be getting what they need. Did that answer your?
Yeah, if you're lacking something, you'll be lacking. It won't be thriving.
Yep. So check the soil when it's wet, check the soil when it's dry, and all of a sudden you do the, aha, I know what's missing. Anybody else want to hammer me into the corner? Yes.
So can you bring naturally the sugar into the soil like with green manure or certain plants? Or do you have to add it?
Did everybody hear that? Can you add carbon to the soil with green manures and cover crops? We okay on time, Lauren?
5 minutes.
Perfect. There's a sequence. Thank you for that wonderful question/comment. There's a sequence that we have learned over many, many different years in trial and error. And what we have found is there's 3 forms of carbon that you need to be focused on. Number 1, if you liquefy a sugar, a white household table sugar, that sugar is in liquid form, form number 1. That liquid form feeds the microbes very quickly, very easily, and very efficiently. The microbes in the soil, the aerobic workers in the soil, will take that sugar from liquid form and turn it into gas form, CO2. CO2 isn't necessarily what the industry tells us. Because the industry, and I don't know if they've set it up here, but in the States, they'll say, do not till your soil. Number one, you're going to kill all the mycorrhizal fungi. Number two, you're going to lose all your carbon. All of it. Lose it. Gone. Never to return. Here's the simple science. When a microbe breathes in atmospheric air, and just like we do, exhales carbon dioxide, CO2, that's 1.5 times heavier than atmospheric air. How are you going to lose that with tillage? Here's the other point. When these microbes are eating and breeding and breathing and partying and honeymooning and doing all the cool stuff, they have to exhale that CO2 that's 1.5 times heavier than air. They have to exhale it, exhale it, exhale it, because the plant may have its leaves 1 inch from the dirt, 3 inches from the dirt, a foot, 5 feet from the dirt. They have to exhale that up before the stomatas, the cells that open and close and take in air nutrients, can suck that CO2, carbon dioxide, into the plant and circulate it. When you add sugar, all you're really doing is feeding the microbe. When you're adding sugar, you're temporarily giving that plant a little boost, a little shot, a little oomph. It isn't going to be enough to change your numbers. And what I mean by that, changing the numbers, what we have found, and in fact, Greg and I were just talking last night, if your plants are under 10 bricks of sugar, depending on how far below 10 bricks they are, that plant hasn't been making enough sugar to put back into the system what you've harvested off. Now, we've never had to worry about carbon or a carbon to nitrogen ratio because most of our soils have had enough carbon to grow a crop that we can pay off debt, buy new equipment, upgrade what we have. But all of a sudden, if you've been below 10 bricks of sugar for a few years, you see hell's coming a little quicker. And the numbers and the testing, the carbon to nitrogen, the oxygen, the bricks, will tell you where you're at. And by rebuilding the carbon, which we will talk about tomorrow a little bit, is going to change the dynamics. And many of the minerals, the copper, the iron, the zinc, the manganese, the boron, that may be tied up, that everybody's having to buy because Roundup chelates it, as your carbon numbers come up and your oxygen is in the soil, the microbes will show you that you have more of those minerals in the soil by making them available than what you imagined. And you will not have to continue buying as many of these trace and micro minerals as what you are right now. Availability with the environment and a healthy workforce of microbes is what's going to be the first step to success, chemical anti-dependency or less dependency, and a better, more consistent crop. And with that, I hope this has been of value. And sorry, the bad news is you're stuck with me right after coffee. No, you guys changed it. I'll just go sit down. So hopefully this information has been helpful. And thank you for your attendance, and we will see you at the next session.